Fáilte. Welcome to this episode of The Language Question, Ceshna Tongan, a conversation about the Irish language and its history for anyone curious about their relationship with it and its role in our identity. Our guest in this episode is Antain Mac Lochlainn. Antain is a prolific author and translator. He has written many works on correct usage of the language and has developed many resources to help those teaching and learning the language. He has written both fiction and non-fiction, and his latest book is an examination of Stoic and Epicurean philosophy, Os Gaeilge, which resonated with me particularly on many levels. I hope you enjoy listening to this conversation as much as I enjoyed having it. I continue to receive amazing feedback from listeners, and I am so grateful to you if you are one of those kind souls who has provided it. If you enjoy or get any benefit from any of these conversations, I would be immensely grateful if you would follow, rate, and review the show on Apple or Spotify to help others like you to discover what we're doing here. Please also be sure to sign up at thelanguagequestion.com/resources to get your complimentary valuable learning resources and to ensure that you stay up to date on upcoming episodes, guests, and to receive exclusive content. Anyhow, here goes with this episode. I hope you enjoy it. Go mine tú soltas. Antain Mac Lochlainn is a prolific, award-winning writer and translator. He has written extensively on matters of style and accuracy in writing in Irish and is the author of In Ord is in Agar, Crinnes and O Bhearla Gaeilge. His most recent book, Tóraíocht and Bheatha, is an explanation of the ancient wisdom of Stoicism and Epicureanism. He is a co-founder of the learning resource websites www.ashter.ie and www.céimaraig.ie. Antain a cara tá fáilte is fitherót agus tá míad thar bheith waíochtaíocht as a bheith ar an show.
Good morning, Tini.
Antain, again, we are so grateful to you to be with us here today, and really looking forward to this conversation. To begin, as we often do here, what I would love to do would be to just ask you to give us where it all began for you in relation to the Irish language, your relationship with the language when you were growing up, what it was like when you were younger, and how it has evolved from there.
Well, strangely, and some people think I'm exaggerating when I say this, when I was growing up, actually, I was only vaguely aware that there was an Irish language. And some people say that can't be true. You must have been aware of the Irish language. But really, we didn't do Irish at school. I remember once there was a visiting nun in our primary school, and she came in and taught us. She didn't actually write the words. She taught us phonetically the hymn Céad Míle Fáilte Róta Isa. And she must have done a good job because I still could actually sing that, actually. But I remember sort of thinking as she was explaining that there was this thing called the Irish language, I thought, yes, that's it. That's the explanation for all these strange words we have. It's the explanation for all these strange place names that the English newsreaders can't say. They don't say a Hohill or Port Glenone. They say Port Glen 1 and a Hog Hill. And, all these words we have like, someone who talks too much is a ganch and all these type of things. And I thought, yes, this makes sense. But for some reason, only known to herself, she followed this up with, she said, yes, there is an Irish language, but it's dead now. So you don't have to worry about it. So it wasn't until my brother actually went to secondary school and they actually studied Irish in Dominican College in Portstewart. And I remember him bringing home these sort of textbooks now, which would be very old-fashioned. Things like Abertí agus Ashti. It might, in the older listeners, it might actually bring a flash of recognition that. But that's how I actually sort of began to realise that there was a spoken language and that there was such a thing as the Gaeltacht.
And that is fascinating. And because you grew up in Northern Ireland, in Coleraine, isn't that correct?
That's right, yeah.
And so there wouldn't have been any presence of the language anywhere locally to you.
Well, that's it. Very much. That's very much the case. I suppose I was aware. I mean, I watched the news. I heard words like Taoiseach and Taoiseach and Dáiléireann and things like that. But I didn't really make a connection between that and the spoken language. And there just wasn't anywhere really you could learn Irish. There were no night classes. You didn't do it at school. I think there's a perception maybe among members of the unionist community about Catholic schools in the North. They tend to think that they're actually kind of little academies of revolution, and everybody does Irish history and Irish language and, plays GAA, things like this. Not the case at all. Actually, our school was I don't know what Pierce would say about it. I don't think murder machine would be I think that would be too mild. Um, we just had none of that, and so there was nowhere really to learn it. And I didn't really even begin to make the first steps really until I was probably about 22 or 23, when I began tentatively to try to learn.
And what was the catalyst for that to what I suppose, because I mean, having come to that point in life, I'm so curious here because you were you still in education at that stage at 22?
No, I was actually for quite a long time unemployed. There was terrible unemployment in that period, the 1980s. And really, I suppose you could say it was a project. It was something to do when you weren't doing anything else. But I suppose, let's be honest, I suppose there was something nationalistic in it, that I sort of felt this was something that kind of was denied to me, and, I should appropriate it for myself. But it wasn't predominantly nationalistic, actually. It was mostly a sense of, I just thought it was very exciting. I just thought, we have a language. This is an absolutely incredible thing. Why didn't nobody ever tell me? It just seemed like such a glaring thing to miss out on. And I suppose I did probably feel a bit cheated, really, that it hadn't been a part of my education, and kind of resolved to do it for myself.
And how did you go about that then?
Very haphazardly. I remember you couldn't really get a very good RTE reception. I remember sort of standing on a fence, sort of holding up the radio, trying to get a reception to hear. I remember RTE had a learners program on at the time called Tóraíocht, I think, with Donal O'Boyle. Donal O'Boyle wrote the pieces, I think. That and doing things well over my head. I mean, like getting books out of the library that I couldn't make head or tail of, sort of academic books, So the big turning point came. You might actually heard of this gentleman, actually, Brian Mullen. He's a broadcaster. He has a very well thought of music program on BBC Radio Ulster, Castlar. And Brian did extramural classes in university. So that was the first time I actually had a sort of structured class and actual structured teaching materials. And he was a very good teacher, of course, so I was lucky. I've been lucky actually all my life, actually, with teachers. Actually, I'm very grateful to them. I've always had really excellent, very committed teachers.
Extraordinary. But you didn't, because you mentioned your brother, I think you said, studied it at secondary level, but you didn't, that wasn't a feature of your education?
No, there's this rather divisive thing in, well, there was, I think it still might survive in some guys. You had to do the 11 plus as a sort of entrance exam at the age of 11. And if you fail, you go into the state schools. If you pass, you go into private schools, or, grammar schools as they're known. So I actually failed. So there was no chance of learning Irish where I was. We barely learned English. Yeah. So those classes with Brian were fantastic. And then there was a great program in the University of Ulster in Tóraíocht. Really quite trailblazing, I thought, and marvellous. And it's a pity that it doesn't exist anymore. And I think it's a shame because there's a need for it. It was an ab initio course. In other words, a course that started on the assumption that you didn't have a word of Irish, just complete beginner's course. And if you succeeded after year one of that course, you could get into the degree program. And so that was my route into studying Irish at university, for a degree. Marvelous teacher called Michal Lamorochu, very committed, very incredibly energetic teacher. So that was good. And as I say, I don't know why that course was discontinued. I think there's a case for similar courses actually throughout the country, but I can see that there might be some sensitivities about having a course like that in the South, because it would be almost like saying people can spend long years in education and come out without a word. So
Yeah,
there might be
yeah.
some sensitivities in having it, but it was fantastic. There was no literature, no folklore, just the language. And really, you would have to be pretty lacking if you didn't pick something up during that intensive input, you know?
Yeah, no, but I think the point you make there is extraordinarily valuable, and because there is this kind of institutionalized view here that we've done it for 14 years, so therefore you must have picked up something. And of course, you don't just pick it up. I mean, I just having gone back to the language now, like even things like masculine and feminine nouns, I never knew such a thing existed. I would
Mhm.
swear on a stack of Bibles that nobody ever told me that when I was, or certainly I wasn't paying any attention if they did. But just the basic fundamentals of things that are assumed because we've spent so much time in formal education, somehow kind of by osmosis that we will have acquired this. And therefore, we can start from scratch, let's say, with fundamentals for adult learners.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And it was interesting actually because even though the university was in the north, and even though the troubles were in full swing, there was actually a very large number of students from the south because it was previous to Niamh Ranach introduced sort of fees. People didn't have to pay fees. So actually going north actually was a great attraction for people because they could avoid paying the fees. That reform wasn't in place yet. So a lot of the people from the south were actually kind of, you could say, faux debutante. I mean, they weren't really, I mean, they did have some Irish, but actually they were kind of challenged by that course because they had to unlearn things. I mean, for example, they were pulled up on their pronunciation. The pronunciation was considered a bit sloppy. And they were, as you say, introduced to sort of basic grammar concepts that they hadn't really, you know, they had no familiarity with. So it was actually not uncommon for people who were genuine beginners to actually fly through that course with far fewer problems than some of the people who had actually studied Irish previously. It was a phenomenon that was remarked upon, that it was the complete beginners actually that sort of won the race. But like that old fable, with the tortoise and the hare.
Sure, if we come with the beginner's mind,
Mm.
we're from a better starting point. But I mean, that must have taken in just incredible motivation and dedication. I mean, I'm just thinking particularly of listeners here who are maybe kind of coming back now as adult learners to the language today, where we're doing so in an environment where, first of all, the medium that we're doing this on is an internet based podcast accessible anywhere on multiple different types of devices and media. I mean, we have access to just the entire knowledge of the universe at our fingertips on a mobile device, and just the almost limitless resources that we have. I mean, people joke about our kind of feel it's almost like a badge of honor for learners from over 10 years ago who've carried Chonglin around in their bag.
Yeah.
It was, that's the scars on their back, whereas now today we have it sitting here in the mobile phone. And I mean, you're talking there about having to stand out the window, hold your hand out the window with the wireless, trying to get signal to listen to a radio show. I mean, I think people maybe just don't appreciate how extraordinarily accessible everything has become from a learning perspective currently.
Oh yeah, it's a definite improvement. I mean, I'm looking back at those days without any kind of nostalgia.
Sure.
It was crazy what people had to do, and I also I think another you mentioned the technology, and that's certainly true. But there's also been a professionalization of teaching Irish as well. Like I remember, going to night classes, and it would just be somebody who might be a couple of chapters ahead of you in the book, who was doing this. These people doing it out of the goodness of their hearts. So that's another welcome development. I think that there is actually a sort of network of professional night classes for adult learners and so on, courses for adult learners. It's another thing that was missing in my day, and as I say, having said that, I was very lucky. Even the kind of voluntary teachers I had were all very if they weren't very knowledgeable, they were very enthusiastic.
And can I bring you forward then from the that period of let's say language acquisition where you made that extraordinary step in your twenties to learn the language completely from scratch and then well certainly to now have acquired extraordinary proficiency in the language. But how did it then evolve in terms of how you were using it in your life as you went along? How did that unfold?
Well, I suppose one thing about the life of the university in Coleraine is that the students that did actually speak Irish. Well, not all of them did, but there were groups of people who it would just been strange to speak English to them. So that became my kind of social circle, I suppose. And then when I left university, I did a postgrad. So, I suppose I did have a prolonged period in that milieu. And, it was the same people I was mixing with. And, Irish was the language of that group of people. And another thing Corian did, of course, that course did is it put you in contact with the Gaeltacht as well, because the Gaeltacht for me was something actually quite exotic, really. I literally had no idea what would happen when you went to the Gaeltacht. Would people understand if you spoke English? Would people understand if you spoke Irish? What was happening there? So they sent you there to Garta Hark in Donegal for 3 weeks every year. And through that, of course, that was another kind of social life, just visiting the Gaeltacht and meeting people there. And, again, people think I'm exaggerating here, but I remember one person on the course who thought that the Gaeltacht was a government building. When she said she was going to the Gaeltacht, she thought she was visiting like a government office in Galway or something like that. And just this idea that there were people who actually spoke Irish outside of this kind of hothouse atmosphere in the university, it just seemed very unlikely. So it was an eye opener just to go to the Gaeltacht as well, because to meet people who had no great ideological attachment to Irish, or who weren't Irish enthusiasts or anything like that, who just happened to speak it, and it's a very necessary kind of corrective to a certain type of thinking that I believe.
And how then does that come forward to, let's say, how you use the language? I mean, I want to just come back in a moment to what you then went on to work in the language in terms of your creative output. But how about it in terms of how you use the language in your everyday life? Is what does that look like for you?
I suppose it looks like really the greater part of my sort of social and cultural life is takes place through Irish. For example, I do try to read most things that come out in Irish, although that's increasingly difficult now. I mean, when I began to learn the language, I mean, there might be 4 or 5 books a year worth reading. Now, actually, I've got a kind of to read pile beside my bed. Somebody told me actually that now there are as many books published in Irish every year in Ireland as there would have been all books published in Ireland in the 1980s. I don't know whether, I'm not an expert, I can't say whether that's factual or not, but certainly it does seem the case to me that it's just hard to keep up with it now, actually. There's just so much. TG Catter as well, of course. Most of the kind of. I think it's just very important, actually, to support things. I mean, sometimes I meet Irish speakers who they'd be critical. For example, they would say something like the Abbey Theatre, they don't have any plays in Irish, that's a disgrace. And it is. But, the question is, if there had been a play in the Abbey Theatre in Irish, would they have gone to it? you know, uh, I think it's actually very important to listen to podcasts like this, and not out of a sense of duty, but to become involved in them as well and to support them. Listening to Irish language programming, this type of thing. There's not much point there being a sort of cultural output in the Irish language if there's nobody listening. So I think I remember actually one of the things I did was I became involved with journalism in Irish and with the newspaper Foinse. And I remember when Foinse was being formed, Padraig O'Cade, the businessman from Galway, who was the man who set the ball rolling, he talked about how many Irish speakers there were, according to the census. And he said, if we get even a fraction of those, we'll have tens of thousands of readers. But of course, that's not what happened. And I think that's very disappointing. I can't quite work out why. You know, if we don't support these things, they're not going to be there.
Completely. I mean, and yeah, it's so so critical. And tell me, and then I mean, in terms of, I mean, so that's what the language, how you came to it, and how it evolved, and how it looks like for you today, and how you use it. But let's just talk then. Could we, if you don't mind, come to your actual your the point at which you kind of started becoming you decided to create in the Irish language, and when you started to write in the Irish language, and how did that how did that come about, and that whole process?
That's actually very interesting. Well, I suppose I did write a few kind of non-fiction things. Uh, when I was a postgrad, I was actually living in Derry, and there was just so much going on there. So I just sort of thought, there were these Irish language forums. There were places where you could actually make Irish language material available. There was, in the Irish Times, for example, there was a weekly article, core. So I remember actually one of the first pieces I ever wrote. Have I writ? I'm having problems with my English here, Finn. I remember sending an article into Tomás Mac Lochlainn, God love him, who's Lochlainn Fearing now. He was editor of Core at the time, and just been really just a real buzz, when this article got published, So I suppose I was kind of hooked then, and it didn't seem. I didn't ever think of it as something that was going to put butter on my bread, so to speak. I just sort of thought of it as a bit of a hobby, I suppose, or as I was never going to make a living out of it. So I was actually very surprised when I did. It sort of it surprised me more than anybody else that I managed to carve a career out of writing in Irish and teaching translation and so on. It's a very specialized niche. And it was never, I had no plan or anything. I never had a career plan. It just, one thing seemed to follow another, and here I am.
Well, indeed, you are. I mean, I'm just thinking, listening to you there, of listening to Nuala Gonal writing about and talking about. I mean, for her, it was a very, it was a very big decision. This decision that, if you like, deciding to, she made a very conscious decision that she was going to write in Irish, and I mean, I think she describes it at one stage as saying she was kind of committing herself to writing in a language that might be dead before she was, and how, and I think her poem Keshnatang, which is the inspiration for the title to this podcast, is very much bound up with this idea of the vulnerability of the language, and how she was putting it if you like, casting it into the stream and hoping that it would all work. For you, you didn't have that same consideration in advance of where it was all going. It was a gradual progression that you eased yourself into.
Yeah, I can't really say it was thought out. Everything just seemed to be a process, and one thing after another. But the point you make, though, about this awareness, I think it was the Scottish poet Sorley McElhaney referred to Gaelic as a canún waswer, a corusmuintin and canún waswer, putting thoughts into a moribund or a dying language. Yeah, I think you would have to be deluded to be, to deny the fact that the Irish language is threatened in a great many ways. And you have to come up with some sort of attitude to that. And I remember being my friends at university. It was a very common thing, and I know this. Everyone listening to this will immediately recognize when you tell people you were studying Irish, it was, oh, you do realize that's a dying language, don't you? And so on and so forth. And some people could actually quote you figures, and it was actually very hard to debate with them because they, they actually seemed to have a lot of facts on their side. They were able to marshal these arguments about Irish being on the way out. I remember when Reg Hindley's book, The Death of the Irish Language, came out, there was a kind of pall over the whole Irish speaking world because it was such a hard thing to argue against, and you had to have some sort of attitude to cope with all that. I suppose my attitude has always been, this is just too good to lose. When I listen to someone like Lida Solera singing, or someone, like the Scottish singer Mary Smith singing Shanos, when I read the best literature in Irish, I just think to myself, I don't care what the odds are, actually. This is just a choice I've made, that this is something which is very valuable to me. And I'm going to stick with it no matter what. I had a friend, those were the days when people used to hitchhike. And of course, when he hitchhiked and when people gave him a lift and said, "What do you do?" He said, "I study Irish at college." And they would say, "What do you do that for?" And he came up with this defense, which struck everybody. Nobody had anything to say after he produced this defense. "Because I'm mad," he would say. And that was the end of the conversation, because
Yeah.
there was no further conversation
Well,
possible. And it
that
was very
explains it,
effective.
I guess. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I don't know if we could come forward then. So in terms of your writing itself, you started, I think, RT, certain some of your early work that I see listed is fiction. Was that correct?
Yeah, yeah, and it's a bit of a regret, actually, that I don't have more time to write fiction, but I hopefully now, in the years to come, I will have. Um, I seemed, I can't really explain how it was that I began to write about matters of accuracy and style and translation and so on. Um, I think it's maybe something to do with the fact that I learned the language later in life, because you really, this kind of childlike way of learning the language through repetition and through imitation, that's not really open to an adult. If you're an adult, you do have to learn the rules. That's the only way to do it. Otherwise, you couldn't get beyond parroting a few phrases. If you want to construct a sentence, you have to know what classal kivnista is, and you have to know about the genitive and all this type of stuff. So I suppose that's probably the root of it, that I always had to think quite self-consciously, really, about the language and the structures of the language. And because I learned it myself, I had a pretty good idea what what the things are that actually give people difficulty. And I also did quite a bit of teaching. I don't think I actually was a very good language teacher, actually. I don't think I was very good at, if I was teaching, say, for example, medium level, I didn't really seem to have a way to really get the information across. But I noticed as I went up a level or two, and I could talk about pretty advanced things in the language, that actually seemed to suit me better. And I suppose that's how I ended up writing these things about points of accuracy and correct usage and so on, because I'd actually reflected a lot upon them myself.
That's very interesting. And can you tell me, did you have a good grasp of grammar in English before you started learning Irish?
Actually, not at all. That's the strange thing about it. I learned grammar through learning Irish. And that's not actually an unusual experience. Actually, many people will tell you that. People who learned Irish later in life, that, if someone asks them to explain an English language sentence, really, they can only do it through recourse to things like, Reochla agus Frasa Reochla agus, or things, that type of thing. So I've tried actually to learn French as well. And to be honest, I haven't made any great headway. I think I can speak it, but the French don't seem to think I can speak it. And they just sort of look at me blankly. So it's not as if I've any great flair for language learning, I don't think. I think it's motivation, really. It's all about motivation. I just really wanted to learn Irish. So I was going to learn Irish, should it have to walk over hot coals to do it. And maybe that's why I've fallen down a bit in the French.
Well, let's take it one step at a time, shall we? And I think you've certainly nailed the first one anyway. So yes, you started with fiction. You then moved to the whole area of crinus and style and accuracy in writing in Irish. And I'm one of the beneficiaries of the work that you've done there, and I'm so grateful to you for having done so. But also, then you worked. I know you still work, but you have done a lot of work in the area of translation. It has been a major part of your life. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, well, I suppose you'd have to say first of all, it was a means to an end. You have to you have to earn a living somehow. Um, but I actually do find it very rewarding, and I don't really make the big distinction that a lot of people would. You hear people talking about literary translation. That's glamorous, that's creative, that's imaginative, and translating, say, an information leaflet for I don't know, the National Library or something, that's boring. And I think the terms they use in translation studies is they would call the information leaflet a pragmatic text, and some people think there's one set of rules for that and another set of rules for literary translation. But I suppose I'm just one of these people. I like doing crosswords. I like solving language puzzles. So whatever the context is, when you get a sentence that has to be rendered in Irish, and you have to actually think about how you're going to do this, how the sort of syntactic challenges in the sentence can be dealt with, I find that kind of entertaining no matter what I'm doing. Having said that, I mean, there are some texts which are just very, very boring, financial statements and so on. I think maybe, let the machines do those. I think
Yeah.
it'll be better for everybody.
And because you've worked, I mean, whatever about some of those more boring texts, I was delighted to see that you got to translate some of the Asterix and Obelix books into Irish. I was delighted. That must have been enjoyable.
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah. Very painstaking because of the word count. Not even the word count. Sometimes the character count. You have to get. There's only so much space in those little balloons. And but actually, it was very interesting. That company, I can't remember the name of the company who uh, produced those books, but it's a multi-million industry. The whole Obelix thing and Asterix. There are theme parks, there are films, and so on. I was actually very impressed with the freedom they gave the translators. Actually, I thought it'd be real kind of have to reproduce this very loyally, but I think they had the foresight to see that you couldn't. Just that the wordplay, it wasn't possible to reproduce it. Um, yeah, it was challenging. I think my favorite thing I did there was among the names, everything, all the Romans had to end with US, like Marcus and so on and so forth. So I've got a character called Laurus Bossaris, which I was I was very proud of.
Yeah,
We
because
find
now
it's
that I think about it,
achievement.
you had kind of getafix and all of these plays on the
Mhm.
Gaulish words and so on. So bringing that across must have been interesting.
Yeah, you had to actually, at the end of it all, you had to actually almost like have a defense of it. I mean, they asked you to explain your decisions frame by frame. And initially, I thought, this is a bit of a task. But actually, it was very interesting because it made you think about what you'd done. Why did you change this, and why did you do this and that? Some of the estates, some of the literary estates, actually can be very protective of the work. I also translated some work for some for Goom, two books by C.S. Lewis in the Narnia series. And you just couldn't do what you wanted with those. I mean, you couldn't rewrite those. They're kind of like you have to show some regard for what was in the original book. But Asterix, it was just like playtime. It was you could
Sure.
do whatever you felt.
And then I also saw, and I was fascinated by the fact that you have done translation now in Scots Gaelic, and could you, is that into or from?
From, yeah,
From, okay.
short stories by a number of authors. There was a very uh, really good modern literature project called Urscale, started by a man with the very suitable name of John Story. He was behind that and trying to bring a new generation of prose writers into Gaelic because I suppose a bit like Irish, actually, poetry was really to the fore in Gaelic and there wasn't really much prose going on. So now there are people like Martin McAteer writing in prose, and Padraig Campbell, people like that. And so that was from Gaelic. I'm very interested in Gaelic and very sympathetic towards it, but I find it very, very difficult to speak. It's so similar to Irish that when I try to speak it, just Irish comes out. It's almost as if I woke up one morning and said, "Right, this morning it's going to be Munster Irish
Yeah,
from
yeah.
start to." You couldn't possibly do that; it would just be too difficult. And
That's essentially
Gaelic's a
the
bit like
thing,
that.
though, isn't it?
Yeah,
I mean, that's
that's
really
what
what's happening, isn't it?
that's what I find. It's like it's you'd be so self conscious about it that you probably wouldn't succeed in saying anything really.
Yeah.
But it's beautiful, and I think one half of the story. Um, and earlier when you asked why I began to learn Irish, and I said, if we're honest about it, I think quite a lot of people in the north learn Irish. Initially, nationalism was part of it. They want to assert their Irishness, understandably. Um, but I think as you go on, that actually fades. And I think it's the intrinsic interest of the language then that keeps people involved. So, it's a fascinating idea that you begin to learn a language out of a sense of Irishness, and you find yourself listening to recordings of Gaelic speakers in Canada, and, reading books written by free Presbyterians from the islands. I particularly cherish Scots Gaelic because it gives you that kind of dimension, that extra national sort of transnational kind of dimension. Uh, sometimes in the Irish language, you think you know everybody who's involved in it. It's such a small little world, and then there's this other kind of Gaelic speaking world across the water, which is there too, and uh, really quite fascinating.
Wonderful, wonderful. What I would like to, I mean, for those who may not be familiar with the work directly, and I can't recommend it highly enough, is I have here in my hand In Ord Isinagar, which is a book I was introduced to. You mentioned getting books from the library that were way out of your league, and that was one for me. I would have to say, but what struck me about it, reading it very, very slowly with a dictionary, as I then was and still am, I have to confess when I come to it. But the thing that immediately just captivated me in when I was looking at the book is I was saying this guy is thinking very deeply and broadly about this language and subject matter because political thought and philosophy are there in the book, and that immediately just that just made me so interested and curious. I mean, you're seeing reference to George Orwell, Karl Marx, Jacques Derrida, Ludwig Wittgenstein, and I'm thinking this guy's thinking, he's thinking big about how he's thinking about this whole language question. Would you mind just talking to us about that for a bit?
Um, well, I don't really have a great theory of language. I suppose I'd have to say, Finine, I'm interested in things that are useful. Um, I find quite a lot of the kind of academic discussion around translation a bit frustrating, which is one of the reasons why why I wrote that book, because I had read a ton of books saying with titles like A Guide to Translation and Teach Yourself Translation and so on and so forth. And you didn't learn anything from them. There were just these kind of general statements about translation, a lot of them actually kind of contradicting each other. People saying things like you have to be true to the text, somebody else saying no, you have to rip the text apart and go off on your own. And I must admit, I suppose the origin of that book was somewhat in a kind of sense of frustration against all this kind of theoretical spouting, really, and just trying to. By the time wrote that book, I'd actually been translating myself for a long time, so it was really kind of two things going on there: my own experience, and mistakes that I had made, many and plentiful, and sort of see what could be, what conclusions could be drawn from that. And also, it's kind of standing on the shoulders of giants in a way, because, the book is full of references to other people who have written about the language, people like Antain Mac Lochlainn, for example, who wrote Tóraíocht Verla, a book about that dreaded mortal sin of Beirlachas, or Anglicism in your Irish. People like, actually, I've sort of got a bit of a difficulty remembering people at the moment. Really, I can't really think of other names, but there is a vast body, Cormac O'Callaghan, writers like this. There's a vast body of people who have observed the Irish language up close and who have made their remarks. Padre O'Leary, for example, notes on Irish idiom. So, and of course, teachers I've had myself who've pointed things out to me. So there's a lot of that going on in it too, really, of just trying to bring together a lot of what's already there, what points that have already been noted about the language.
Yes, I was struck actually just when I was having a look through it in thinking about this conversation, and there's a great quote in there from O'Nolan, 1920. I think English is fond of metaphor and personification. Irish, on the whole, is more restrained and matter of fact. Irish loves logical order. English is sometimes whimsically illogical. English is often elusive and Irish direct. Irish is fond of the concrete, whereas English frequently has the abstract. And just thinking about languages and their own kind of inherent styles and essences. I mean, I think that was because as English, native English speaking learners, I think we come to the language just with an English speaking, like, let's say, default setting, which creates its own difficulties.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. When you read sometimes Irish from a different period, Irish, for example, that was written by people who couldn't speak any English, just the strangeness of it, even now, even after years of having read the language, is very striking. I'm reading a book at the moment by Jeremy Johnson called Cailleach. It's a kind of retelling of Colin Bonus and his company's sort of travels in Europe, founding monasteries and so on. And it's written in this kind of almost medieval Irish. And it's very well done. But just the strangeness of it, indeed, just a turn of phrase. They're on the River Rhine, and they see a waterfall, and he says this waterfall is deafening. But that's not what he says. He says it is a stampede of 900 bulls. It's just these kind of wow kind of turns of phrase. And that's one of the strange things in life. Sometimes you read a very old text that actually can come across as quite new and revolutionary and totally out of sync with what you're expecting. But yeah, you're right. I mean, they're absolutely one of the challenges of being a translator actually is, some people expect almost the Irish language just to slot into the space where the English was. Sometimes literally when they're talking about designing, if there's a poster and there's 5 words in English in the poster, well, there better be 5 words in Irish on the poster as well. There is this kind of mentality that Irish can just almost like, it's a shadow language to English, which is very harmful, I think, because, if there has to be 20 words in the Irish poster, so be it.
Well, that brings us very, very nice, I think, to your own reference in Ordo Synagogue, because one of the things that it sent me off to read was Politics in the English Language, the George Orwell essay, and again, so valuable and echoing so many of the things that you mentioned there about the importance of meaning. But I was looking at Orwell's, and you quote this sentence that Orwell despises: the not on black dog was chasing a not on small rabbit across a not on green field, which reminded me of somebody telling me going to the doctor once and was told that they were not asymptomatic, which is worrying. But
Yeah.
but Orwell has his 5 rules that he says that he thinks should cover most cases. That he says: never use a metaphor, simile, or other figure of speech which you are used to seeing in print. Never use a long word where a short word will do. If it is possible to cut a word out, always cut it out. never use passive voice where you can use the active, never use a foreign phrase, scientific word, or jargon if you can think of an everyday English equivalent, and break any of these rules sooner than say anything outright barbarous. Okay, so I think these are good rules. But again, let's remember they're talking about the English language. And I was just thinking about two of them in particular, and what you would think about it in the context of our use of Irish. So let's say never use a metaphor, simile, or other figure of speech which you're used to seeing in print. How do we reconcile that, or can that apply when we're working in Irish and we are being, we're encouraged about we have Nahana Kainta, Shanokul, things like that? How do you feel about those kinds of issues?
Yeah, I think sometimes, you just have to bear the reader's ability in the language. You have to bear that in mind. Actually, even, the question of frequency, even if you're dealing with a number of words or phrases that mean more or less the same thing, like nobody's perfect, the VNC gan lacht. There are other ways to say that in Irish. You could say, is minnig markach mai ar a talu, is often a good rider fell off the horse, and things like that. But I think if you're translating, for example, for a general audience, you do have to bear in mind that people might not get that, and you might go towards the more familiar EV&C gan lacht. It is true, there are some cliches which people just detest, which are Elaine Tintin where the Hinton and things like this. But it's a very personal thing, it's just so hard to lay down rules on that. Um,
You had a very funny one, I thought, listening to you speak about this in another context. I think you were talking about drug dealers, I think, were being spoken about in some article. Do you remember that? Yeah.
that's right. Yes, that's right. Yeah, they use the phrase "an clochas for just sheer at a buttoning." The health and safety of people is the furthest stone back on the rosary of these men. It's just the idea
Yeah.
of these pushers going around with their rosary beads. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah,
Yeah.
and sometimes you do get these kind of mixed metaphors too. Which are just crazy. Like um, I saw something once about fishermen. I said it was very hard for them to earn a living, but the way it was actually said in Irish was "Tá sé deacair dóibh a maithe ó chóirte dír." It's hard to bring, actually what the Irish actually is, it's hard for them to bring a living into the shore. It just seems so strange in the context of fishermen. So, you do have to have an eye out for that kind of mixed metaphor. Maybe that was intentional, actually. Maybe it was meant to be funny, but it just struck me as being a bit confusing.
Yeah. And then it just to come or at least I'd love your view on Orwell's fourth rule, which was never use the passive where you can use the active. And what struck me about this, and again, if you want to get really nerdy and technical, I think the Brier Ser is not a passive. That's a is it free case or whatever is the passive voice, but certainly we use the Brier Ser. At least my understanding is the Brier Ser is a much better and more useful kind of way of saying things in Irish than where is in English, where using the passive voice might be frowned upon or discouraged.
Oh, yeah. I think sometimes the Brehir Seer is just, it's not just accuracy, actually. Sometimes it's kind of almost like the polite thing to say. Like you might see sometimes signs saying, don't smoke. You'll actually see na catcher tobacco, which is actually a sort of a kind of uh, independent form. Na catcher tobacco. It's not giving that order to anybody in particular. It's just saying, if you actually wrote na kai tobacco, tessa finin makati, it does seem rather sort of blunt. Sometimes the Brehir Seer can actually sort of take the edge off something like that. It's a general statement rather than actually directing it at one person. And,
Smoking
sometimes,
isn't done here. Yeah.
yeah, and sometimes actually you need it to avoid ambiguity. There's a very common mistake now, and if I had one wish, something I could banish from the Irish language overnight, I would choose this one. It's using the kind of past participle instead of the seer here. So people will say things like, they were married last year. Now, let's say that's a reference to the ceremony. They were married at a ceremony in Rome last year. People will say, "Vi should posta nadi," and that just to me means they were in the state of marriage last year, and it actually sort of begs the sort of conclusion that they're not anymore, that they've split up since. So actually, what you need there, you actually need the Brehir to actually get that sense intact. Posu and Nari, yeah, they were married last year, so that actually emphasizes the act rather than the state. So yeah, it's too early to get rid of the Brehir just yet, anyway.
Wonderful, wonderful. Could I come on then, Anton, to I think your most recent book, Tóraíocht na Bheatha, which I'm currently working my way through. My rate of reading makes kind of glaciers look pretty speedy. But I'm getting there. But this book for me is just an absolute joy. Would you mind talking to us about that? First of all, what it's about, and what motivated you to write on that subject, which is a new departure now in writing about Stoicism and Epicureanism, as opposed to language itself per se.
Mm-hmm. Well, I suppose we were talking earlier about how Irish language publishing is really flourishing, and that's certainly true. But there's one aspect of publishing that a sort of genre that I actually like an awful lot, but which isn't really doing so well in Irish is non-fiction. I mean, novels, poetry collections are plenty, but non-fiction not so much. So I've done quite a lot of giving out about this over the years. So I thought, well, stop giving out and actually do something. And then when COVID came along, it seemed like a good time to do it. Um, it's really, that book is a kind of explanation of various sort of Greek and Roman schools of philosophy. Uh, Stoicism in particular, not because I am a Stoic, and not because I'm saying Stoicism is the way to go, but just because there's an awful lot of that material with more text from them than anyone else. Um, and I was interested in particular in a different attitude towards philosophy that they had. You know, when we talk about philosophy nowadays, we think of kind of very academic, very abstract questions, things like, can we ever know what the truth is, or, what is knowledge, and things like this. What is consciousness? These are very deep questions, but I don't know really that we're ever really going to manage to answer them. Uh, the Greeks and the Romans had a completely different attitude towards philosophy. For them, it was more of a verb than a noun. It was something you did. It was something that enhanced your life. It was a sort of code to live by. And I think anyone who knows anything about Buddhism will be familiar with that type of idea. The Eightfold Path. You have an ethical code, a behavioral code, and you live your life according to those understandings and those precepts. But I'm not sure many people know that there's a similar kind of tradition in Europe, in European culture, and also that there's a kind of meditative tradition. The Stoics had many different practices, for example, to sort of inculcate a sense of equanimity and so on. So, yeah, it was just to refamiliarize people with that, especially in the context of Stoicism undergoing something of a revival. It's a pretty trendy thing at the moment.
Yes, I was interested in your thoughts on modern Stoicism, and might come back to those. But I'd love to just start with the epigraph of the book, and if you don't mind, I'll just read out it. Ní bhfuinm pléisiúr as aon ní dá bheith tarva a bheagán, más watalum féin a dálam é. Má mrunfií agna orm an cuineáil go gnoin a gom féinní agus gan í il siú do gine eile isálig a Yultian í. So that's a quote from Seneca, one of his letters to Lucilius on sharing knowledge. And my translation of it is, I derive no pleasure from anything, no matter how beneficial if I learned it for my own good. If wisdom were bestowed upon me on condition that I keep it to myself and not impart it to others, I would refuse it. And in reading that, Anton, I felt you have exemplified that message in all of the work that you have done. It's extraordinary.
Well, thank you, Finian. Yeah, I suppose I could say that's intentional because, in so many ways, it's just really strange that I'm here. I mean, I grew up in a town with no Irish in it. I grew up in a family where nobody went to university. So it is a strange kind of set of circumstances that find me here. So I do feel kind of obliged to whatever came my way to kind of pass it on, I suppose. And as I say, so much of it actually really is just attributable to teachers and to other commentators on the language. So it's really a kind of recycling, really.
And I love as well the fact that you have you want to see more nonfiction writing in Irish, so you decided to write it. I'm reminded of, I think, Tig McDonegan quotes in the opening of the Fyodor Fila book about how the Angela, is it Angela Mayo Angela quote about, if the book that you want to see in the world doesn't exist, you have to write it. I think so. So wonderful. I mean, the next line of the quote of that that quote you have in the epigraph actually is, "No good thing is pleasant to possess without friends to share it." So I think you're absolutely exemplifying the stoicism that you're sharing us in the book. But would you mind just talking about the translations? I was very interested in. I mean, the book is wonderful, and most of at least so far as I'm going through them, some of the work in English is let's say where it is written originally in English, it's transposed in English in the book. But wherever you're referring to quotes from the original Greek or Roman texts, you have them translated into Irish. How did you go about doing that?
Uh, Great difficulty. Uh,
Yeah.
I can't actually speak Greek or Latin, and I suppose you could say actually it was a bit of a cheeky thing to do, really, but I did take a lot of care over it. I did consult kind of academic editions of translations and French in French and English. So they were very heavily annotated. So whenever the sense was kind of queried, or whenever there were various kind of versions in manuscripts, I did actually take that into account uh, in trying to translate it. So, I couldn't translate the Greek or the Latin, but at the same time, I think the sense is more or less there because a lot of the French and English translators, people like Pierre Hadot, they would have taken a tremendous amount of care in their French translation. So, you're kind of in safe hands there. Uh, I think they were just such wonderful writers. Um, I remember actually seeing a description of Stoicism and the whole revival of Stoicism, and one panelist on this uh, academic kind of gathering, he was asked, well, Stoicism, people say that cognitive behavioral therapy is based on it. People say that minimalism is based on Epicureanism. All these modern movements owe their inspiration from these Greek schools. Why not just follow the modern movements and forget about all this stuff? Why not just go with CBT? And the panelist said, a very unusual thing for an academic. He said, because they wrote beautifully. I thought it was a very odd thing to hear at an academic conference. And beauty is persuasive, he said. And I think that's absolutely true. Just there's something about, even in translation, the clarity of their explanations. I think some modern philosophical writers could maybe watch and learn. I think, because you know they come across with crystal clarity.
Indeed. You mention somebody who I hadn't been aware of until I read your book, was Elizabeth Anscombe. And would you mind telling us a little bit about her?
She's a very interesting figure, and I'm surprised actually we don't make more of her because, let's face it, Ireland isn't coming down with notable philosophers. She was born in Limerick, very kind of Anglo family, admittedly, and I think went to England at a very young age. But um, she was very interesting from the point of view that she was deeply involved in very abstract analytical philosophy of the kind. She actually translated Wittgenstein, which is hats off to Elizabeth, I say. Um, that could not have been easy. And she was an associate of Wittgenstein's. I think she assisted him, But she was very worried about the problems of ethics in modern life. There are two real schools of ethics. One is a kind of utilitarian school, which sort of would say, well, do the thing which produces the best result, or avoid the thing that would produce the worst result. But that's very fraught and just open to abuse. I mean, Stalin could say he was doing the best thing. He was protecting socialism. And the people who kept their mouths shut during the purges and during the Gulag years, they could say the same thing. Well, we didn't want to endanger this great project. The other one is a kind of, I suppose, a sense of duty, that you do things through a sense of duty. But again, that's kind of problematical. So Elizabeth Anscombe pointed out that there was this other school of ethics. There was this school of ethics that we have from the Stoics, which basically is a kind of virtue ethics, that you try to just have a set of values and live by them. And really that your ethics really is, and your character are kind of like intertwined in a way, that there's nothing kind of your life and a set of abstract rules. You try to live up to these values that you signed up to. It's a very kind of, at the time, it was this kind of school of ethics that nobody would have much time for. But she actually lived it herself because she was fearless, really. She was, I think it was Oxford, she lectured, and they were going to award an honorary degree upon Truman, who was, of course, the man who ordered nuclear bombs to fall on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And she objected very strongly, said she was not going to have hand her part in this. And of course, the arguments produced then were exact examples of the kind of thing she was talking about. People said, well, you see, that was the least bad thing we did when we dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That argument sort of written large, really. So she wasn't having any of it. And I don't know how that controversy ended. She's a very colourful person too. Wore men's clothes a lot, sort of tweed jackets, tweed suits, smoked cigars. I actually searched out. I was trying to find it. Was there any footage of her anywhere? And I couldn't find anything. But she certainly seems larger than life. So anyone listening in Limerick, I think it would be a good idea to have a Elizabeth Anscombe commemoration.
A school, we'll have to establish one. And also, I mean, no Irish connection was well. We get to an Irish connection through the way you weave it. But Octavia E. Butler, then you choose her. I mean, and I hadn't heard of her previously, but she was somebody who I think the way you describe it, she kind of exemplified that that sort of goal setting, you can achieve anything kind of approach that is sometimes encouraged. Because would you mind just informing our listeners what her how you used her example in the book?
Oh yeah, actually, I used her story to illustrate a point. She was a science fiction writer, and you could say she had a number of disadvantages. Science fiction is a very male. Both authors and readers, a very kind of male-dominated world. Octavia obviously was female, and she was also black. Because that was a strange African American. You don't hear much about African American science fiction writers, or you certainly didn't then. So she was kind of, I suppose you could say, she was up against it, and perhaps she had to steel herself and set herself targets. But she wrote a letter to herself in which she said, I'm going to be a best-selling writer. This is what happens to my books. They just sell in truckloads. And she had a number of kind of exhortations. So be it. This will happen! Exclamation mark! Exclamation mark! And I refer to her in the book because that's not what happened. Actually, she was a very well thought of writer, and she managed to make a living out of writing too, which is no small thing. With teaching creative writing and awards that she won. But she was never a selling writer, really. And the point there is, I suppose, a stoic one, that you maybe set yourself up for failure when you set targets over which you have no control. I mean, all she could do was write the best book she could. She couldn't make people read her book. She couldn't make people review it positively. She couldn't influence panels of judges and so on and so forth. So, actually, perhaps a way to avoid a lot of pain in life is just to take control over those things that you directly control yourself and leave the rest to fate, because who knows? Uh, there's so many great artists who weren't appreciated in their time. But that doesn't mean that their life was a failure. They produced great work. It just wasn't recognized at the time. So, how you define success? That's a very fraught question.
Oh, completely. And then I think you go on then to quote Viktor Frankl, the author of Man's Search for Meaning, and the way in which he explained to his students that the pursuit of success was you're chasing the wrong thing, and I think success, like happiness, is a byproduct. Really, it's not something that we can manifest, or certainly have any control over. And then beautifully you bring it to Nuala Ní Dhomhnaill again, her and Ceis na Tongan, her poem, which is the inspiration for the title to this podcast, because she is almost the opposite. She's like the anti Octavia E. Butler, because she consciously chooses to commit herself to the Irish language and to writing in that. If she had never had any reader who would ever read it, that was what she was. I mean, and she's one of our greatest poets. I think if there was to be an Irish female Nobel laureate, I think she should be it. And perhaps if she had written in English, maybe who knows? Just in these kind of choices, but she deliberately chose to write in Irish, and has produced an extraordinary body of work in doing so, which is just phenomenally successful, no matter how many people ever read it. But I thought that was a wonderful little the connection of those three writers.
Yeah, I think that poem is just such a healthy attitude. You know, it's not that I have any kind of lack of an enthusiasm for the Irish language or anything like that, but you can't, in your life, I think, just tie your happiness up with success or failure by certain criteria. That unless the Irish speaking population goes up by 10%, my life is meaningless or something like that. I just like how she. We were talking about this earlier, actually, about how you react to the societal pressures on the Irish language. I think the best thing to do is just to value what's there and do your best. Really, what else can you do? There's the idea of setting targets or judging success by some sort of abstract criteria out of your control. It's not the path to happiness, I don't think.
No, and a fool's errand, I suspect. You mentioned that Dermot Johnson book there on. Can you remind me the name of it again before?
Yeah, Callach.
Callach, yeah,
Yeah.
and that just reminds me of the whole Irish monastic tradition and the Dark Ages and the. And I was just when I was reading your book, while I'm reading it, is there any does that come into the whole question? Were there any Stoic or Epicuric texts that were let's say formed part of the Irish monastic tradition and were preserved or continued in that way? Are you aware of that?
Yeah, well, they most certainly read, particularly Seneca. Seneca was kind of in the Christian era, kind of reimagined as a kind of Christian before his time. There was even a kind of false correspondence forged of letters going between him and St. Peter. Of course, Peter and Seneca actually would have been in Rome at the same time, but there's no evidence that they met. Even as late as the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, writers like E. McAngle mentioned Seneca. So he was part of the curriculum, if you like, And another Stoic writer, Epictetus, wrote a book called Enchiridion Handbook, a kind of almost like Stoicism in miniature, just a set of rules. And that was actually used particularly among monks in the Greek-speaking tradition. They actually used that as a monastic rule. They just took all the references to Socrates out and put Jesus Christ in instead. But that's there are so many aspects of Christianity that are fit so nicely very neatly with Stoicism. They wouldn't have approved of the Stoic cosmology, but a lot about the Stoic ethics would have appealed to them.
Very fascinating. Seneca is an interesting character. I mean, he was far from monastic or ascetic in his. He was a very, very successful, wealthy playwright, I think, and I think was kind of special advisor to Nero until very close to the end. I think he was a powerful political and wealthy man.
Oh, you're quite kind, Finian, because most people just call him a hypocrite because he was talking on one hand about kind of modest living. He was one of the richest men in Rome. I mean, his wealth was absolutely astronomical. He was a kind of early advocate of intermittent fasting. Actually, this kind of thing that's trendy now. You take 2 days, but you don't eat very much. He did that kind of routinely. And, he also held massive banquets and things like that. So, a lot of people think him of as a hypocrite, but it's interesting. There's been a few biographies lately where he's been treated more kindly. He was indeed a kind of advisor to Nero. And that could not have been an easy job because, how do you advise a lunatic? But there are some interpretations now that say, well, look, he was just trying to keep a lid on things. He was trying to protect people from the worst of Nero, and he did actually try to resign, but Nero wouldn't allow him to. It's a bit like the mafia. You don't leave the mafia. You don't resign from Nero's advisory panel. And of course, Nero ultimately ordered him to be killed, invited him to commit suicide, which is a very Roman way of doing things.
Yes. And I could continue this conversation forever, but I think I'll need to just move towards our conclusion. Reluctantly, I have to confess, but in doing so, I want to just maybe touch on a couple of other things around your work. And on the question of translation, I was actually just very, very interested and excited in recent days, actually, to see that Taig McDonegan announced that there is an Estonian version of his wonderful book, Madame Lazare, is, I think, about to be published. Were you involved in that?
Well, this is the role of chance. It was just a chance conversation with the translator, Indrek. He just asked, was there anything worth reading in Irish at the moment? And I pointed him in the direction of Taig's book. So that's how that happened.
Wonderful.
Just by chance. Yeah.
And how is Indrek, is he reading the book? He's an Irish speaker?
Oh yeah. A very very capable Irish speaker, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Oh, it's almost not wishing to detract from Indrek's achievements, but it's almost now as if that's sort of lost its novelty value. When there was a time, if you were introduced to somebody from outside of Ireland who spoke Irish fluently, you'd be, you'd think this is incredible. But now it's almost kind of, with people like Alex Hymans and so on. It's almost like there's another one.
It's inspirational to me. I mean, to think that there is a direct translation from a book written in Irish, direct, and I mean, you would kind of say, okay, it's going to get translated into English, But
Hmm.
here we have the book is being translated directly into Estonian, and of course, the whole question, Estonia is central to the novel. It's all bound up in that whole post-war European context. I thought that was absolutely, it was just a wonderful story, and so I'm delighted to hear that you're that vital link there in between in the middle.
There's another translation story which I took particular heart from. It's the writer Myra Zeff, who mostly writes for very young children, actually quite young children. But she wrote one verse novel called Nonin, which I would recommend to anybody. It's a fantastic book. But a lot of Myra's material is being translated into English. I think this is fantastic because it's usually the other way around. You know, the fact that there's a writer whose books are so notable that they're sort of more or less they just appear in English as well. I think that's marvelous. A real sign of vitality. And of course, she's been translated into all kinds of things. Uh, I think Mandarin, include no Korean, I think, which is wonderful.
Well, that just brings me to a point that I was just wanting to just mention because I was reading Garrod Denver's article on decolonizing the mind recently, and he has in there. I mean, it's a really wonderful essay, but he has in there a couple of points around translation, and I was just wanting to get your view on the question, particularly because I found Your Inordinate Agar an extraordinarily helpful book, but it was I was limited in my ability to actually access it because of where I was in the language journey and still am. But and so I wondered about your thoughts around translating a book like that into English or how you feel about that. But then I was reading in the essay in Denver's essay, he quotes David Lloyd saying that translation embodies the fatal double bind of cultural nationalism. Disseminating the message through English destroys the very language you wish to preserve. And this question about translation into English and how we feel about that. What are your own thoughts on that? I mean, for instance, how would you feel about your translating your books into English, or what are your
Mhm.
thoughts on that?
Oh, I've absolutely not one moment's hesitation. I know the point that Garrett is referring to, and of course you have to be careful. But because I learned the language at a pretty late age, I mean, I was relying on translations of writers like Pádraig O'Conor. You know, they were, part of the reason why I did begin to learn the language because I wanted to access this stuff in its original. And I was aware when I was reading the translation that it wasn't really the real McCoy. So, if only for that kind of popularizing effect, I'm totally in favor of translating into English or anything else. As a matter of fact, Martin O'Kine, Karina Kille being translated twice into English, which is very interesting. I have no problems with that whatsoever because I think people should just be able to read that uh, in the knowledge, sort of humbly knowing that they're reading a facsimile in a way, and hopefully with the like those bilingual editions of poetry, hopefully your eyes should be going on towards the other side of the page eventually, and not just depending on the English.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree, and I've been a consumer of translation, and I try and acquire both whenever I can, and then I try and, like you say, maybe get my sense and then work back across into the other text, and I find it a very valuable way of learning. But finally, Anton, could I just, as we come to the end of the conversation, and I think you've touched on this, the answer to this question already, but I would love to maybe just try and encapsulate it now, based on everything we've spoken about. But for listeners out there, maybe who are seeking to learn the language, and I think you should be an inspiration to them, having done what you've done, having come to it so late in life, and certainly in terms of what you've achieved in the meantime. But for somebody facing the language now and facing a very significant challenge to actually go about acquiring this language or any language. I mean, first of all, what's your Irish language? Why? Why is it important to you? Why should anybody do that? And just what's your why for all of this?
I think it's just to access this language. And you could say, well, if I learned Italian, I'd be able to access the riches of Italian. And so, that's probably considerably greater if you're talking on scale. But, of course, Irish is going to be more relevant to you. It's going to be the surnames of the people you meet, place names that you live in, writers who are writing identifiably with the culture you were born and raised in. Yeah, it's I think maybe T.G. Cahir got it into 2 words when they come up with the motto Súlile. It's such a succinct uh, phrase, just this is another way of looking at the world, but it's a uniquely Irish way of looking at the world. And it shouldn't really be tremendously, there should be enjoyment in it. You should always keep that ahead of you that, there is this prospect that someday you will understand what they're saying on the Nuaíocht, the Nuacht, and you will someday be able to read a whole page of a book without looking up 20 words, you know. Um, yeah, just to access this sort of rich tradition that is just there. It is massively relevant to all of us, and it's massively enriching. Sulele.
Sulella. Well, Akara, I think you've put that beautifully for us, and it is such a wonderful way to round out what has been a fascinating conversation, and I am so grateful to you for being a part of it. Antain Akara, gur raibh míle maith agat bhain mé ansult as an scéal a raibh tú linn beir bua agus beannacht Akara.
Goodbye, Gatini.
Thanks for listening. Gur raibh míle maith agat as a bheith éisteacht. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I would really appreciate your feedback and would be eternally grateful if you would follow, rate and review the show. Please also be sure to sign up at thelanguagequestion.com/resources to get your free valuable learning resources and to stay up to date with upcoming episodes, guests and to receive exclusive content. Slán Tamil.